Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. So today obviously is the start of June. We're in about the first week of June now. So I'm going to be doing my updated predictions for the 2026 US Senate elections. So obviously if you've watched my prior videos, you'll know how those will work. But if you're new to my videos, there are 35 Senate races that are up in 2026 on the Senate. And I'm going to be going through and giving my predictions in every single state. There are three rankings. This is a change from my prior video I'm using the safe, likely, and lean filter. I did remove the tilt filter. So now if it is safe, it's going to be a 15% win or more for either the Democrats or the Republicans. If it is likely, that falls in between 14.9% and 5%. And then if it's lean, it falls under 4.9% or 0. So I removed the tilt, which is 1 point and under. I just decided to lump lean and tilt into one category. And now what I'm also going to do in this video to start out, every race that's going to fall under 5 points as of right now in my current rankings, I'm going to leave as a toss-up, and then I'm going to talk about it more in depth in the video. So first things first, what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to characterize the states that I currently have as safe for both the Democrats and the Republicans. And I'm kind of going to gloss over these states a little bit because they're not going to be competitive and there's not really much sense in spending a lot of time on these states. These are all states that I expect will vote by more than 15% for both the Democratic and Republican candidates when everything is said and done. First things first, I'll start with the Democratic states. The first is the state of Oregon, and next the state of Colorado. No real surprise here. New Mexico would typically be a likely Democratic state, but the Republicans failed to have a candidate on the ballot. So the Democrat is facing a write-in campaign from a Republican, but in terms of actually being on the ballot, there's no Republican. So New Mexico now goes safe for the Democrats. The state of Illinois as well, and its open Senate race is also going to be an over 15-point win once those results are all in. Virginia as well, with Mark Warner, a longtime Democratic incumbent. Given the recent polling data, which I will be showing in just one moment, of President Trump and the Republicans generically, Virginia definitely not going to be a state that's going to be too Republican friendly in these midterms. Virginia goes safe for the Democrats. The state of Delaware will also be a safe Democratic win. Cory Booker will win New Jersey as well, I believe by more than 15 points. Rhode Island will be safe Democratic, and Massachusetts as well. So right off the bat, all the states that are over 15% for the Democrats, I have the Democrats getting up to 43 Senate seats. No really surprises on this map here. And while I mentioned that, I'll just show you the current approval ratings as of the day I'm recording this video for President Trump are 38.5% approved to 57.8% disapprove. So you're looking at a very, very large margin here for Donald Trump, nearly almost 20 points negative for Trump as of today. And for the generic ballot, the Democrats have started to surge in the last few weeks or so. They are now up to 48.4%, Republicans at 40.5%. So the Democrats also are nearing a 8-point lead, and the generic ballot, that certainly seems to suggest more of the big Democratic wave, similar to what 2018 ended up being. These polling data seem to reflect that for the Democrats as well. So that's the updated polling data. Still, though, there are going to be some states that voted very reliably Republican for Donald Trump in 2024, and a lot of Republican senators in past elections that are still going to vote more than 15 points for the Republicans. The first state for sure is the state of Idaho. Next, the state of Wyoming. South Dakota, Mike Rounds will be a safe Republican state. Oklahoma will be a safe Republican state. Arkansas will be safe R. Louisiana as well, even though Bill Cassidy lost his primary, that'll be a safe Republican seat. Alabama will be safe Republican. Tennessee will be safe Republican. Andy Barr will win Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's Senate seat by more than 15 points. And West Virginia will be safe Republican as well. So for sure, this will get the Republicans up to 41 Senate seats, Democrats at 43. So just looking at all the states I currently have as 100% safe, this has the Democrats up 2 seats over the Republicans. Though it is important to note the current composition of the U.S. Senate is Democrats 47, Republicans 53. So the Republicans, with Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie, the Democrats have to flip 4 Senate seats in this cycle to flip the Senate. So the Republicans do have a little bit of an advantage built up on this map. Next, we're going to go to some states that are in the likely Republican and likely Democrat category as of today, which again is in between 14.9% and 5% as well. So let's take a look at some of these states. The first one I'm going to do We're going to start with the state. There's only really one, I believe, for the Democrats, and that's the state of Minnesota. So we're going to start here, and we actually will look at this race. We'll start going more in depth on these. Minnesota, this is an open Senate race. This was Democratic incumbent Senator Tina Smith, who is not seeking re-election. The two Democrat candidates in this race are Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig, though it is looking like Peggy Flanagan will be the Democratic candidate after getting the party endorsement and consistently leading in the polling data. So we expect it'll be Flanagan on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, there are a bunch of candidates running. Michelle Tafoya is the most notable Republican candidate running in this race, and I expect that she'll ultimately end up winning this primary as well. As the only poll there in it from the beginning of May from Qantas Insights, which I don't believe was out the last time I did a Senate video at the time. Tafoya is leading 52% over the rest of the field, so she's going to win that. And then for the general election, all the top political prediction websites have it listed as likely Democratic, and the polling data for Flanagan versus Tafoya, Emerson College's poll from February has Flanagan over Tafoya 47-41, which is a 6-point lead, a likely Democratic ranking. In terms of how Minnesota has voted recently, it voted in the 2024 presidential race for Kamala Harris by 4.2%, so it was technically a lean Democratic win. In 2020 for Joe Biden, it was a likely Democratic win in that election environment. In 2024, though, Amy Klobuchar did win her Senate race by a safe margin, though she seems to be a massive electoral overperformer in the state of Minnesota. In 2020, Tina Smith did win her race by 5.2%. So on the Senate map for 2026, I think we see Minnesota go at a bare minimum of 5 points for Peggy Flanagan, the Democrat. I think it's more likely she probably wins around 8 to 9% in Minnesota, putting the state as likely for the Democrats. So that gets the Democrats at 44, and that's pretty much it for 100% likely Democratic seats right now. You could argue with some of the polling data in, say, New Hampshire or North Carolina or Georgia that they would be likely Democratic, and they very well may end up being that margin when everything is said and done in November. But as of today, I still think there's a good amount of undecided vote that I'm going to keep a lot of these competitive races in either lean or totally toss up for now. So Minnesota is the only likely Democratic state as of today. Next, we're going to go for the states that are likely Republican, and there are a good amount of these that I think are going to vote Republican for sure, but the margin is going to fall under 15 points. One of these is the state of South Carolina with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who Lindsey Graham's popularity is, I think, a large reason why this race is going to end up being a little bit more competitive. He'll be the Republican candidate once again after President Trump has endorsed him. Annie Andrews and Kathleen Fleming Bruce and Kyle Freeman are the candidate, and Brandon Brown are the candidates in this race. Annie Andrews, I would expect to be the Democratic candidate for the general election. It's listed as either likely Republican or safe Republican from most of these rankings, though there have been two Democratic polls that have shown it around a 5-point race for Graham versus Andrews. The main reason I'm cautioning this race for Lindsey Graham is he won his 2020 Senate race against Jamie Harrison in what was the most expensive Senate race of all time at that time by 10.3% in South Carolina. So in an election environment that I would expect to honestly be pretty similar to 2020, if not more Democratic friendly, I think we're going to see a South Carolina Senate race where Lindsey Graham does once again win, but I think he's going to fall under that 15% margin. So South Carolina, I would throw in likely Republican. The state of Mississippi, not as Republican as South Carolina, I would say for sure, but it's going to fall in a similar category. Also, Trump won South Carolina by 18 points in 2024. He won Mississippi by 23 points, though we can look in 2020 where Trump won South Carolina by 11.7, Mississippi was 16.5. So Mississippi's more of a red state, I would say, than South Carolina is, but for a similar reason, a weaker incumbent in Cindy Hyde-Smith. She'll be facing off against the Democrat Scott Collum, and she seems to have a track record of underperforming for a Republican incumbent in the state of Mississippi. Most of the rankings do have it as safe or solid Republican, but the polling data, there's been two polls from Democratic pollsters, and they show it under a 3-point race, actually 47-44 in the first poll from April of 2026. I do think she'll definitely win by more than that, but her Senate race in 2020, I do believe did end up being also right around that 10-point margin that Lindsey Graham ended up winning by as well. So I do think Mississippi will start out as likely Republican, which means it'll fall under 15 points. And I think a large part being the election environment will play a role in that, but I do still think Cindy Hyde-Smith should win that race without too much of a problem. The next state I would throw in as likely Republican would be the state of Florida. This is Republican Senator Ashley Moody. Now, this was Marco Rubio's Senate seat, and Moody was appointed to fill the remainder, or for this election to fill the remainder of the special election. And then this term, I do believe, is going to be up in 2028. So if she wins this race, or whoever wins will have to run again in 2028 anyway. But to fill the remainder of the term, Ashley Moody will be the Republican candidate. It's looking like Alex Vindman or Angie Nixon. Looks more like Alex Vindman will probably be the Democratic candidate. As for the general election, a little bit of a ratings difference here. Some say solid Republican, some say likely Republican, some say lean Republican. In terms of the polling, the most recent poll from Global Strategy Group, which is a Democratic-affiliated pollster on behalf of Vindman's campaign, shows Ashley Moody leading by about 3 points over Alex Vindman. Now, Florida has moved a lot to the Republican direction in recent years. It voted for Donald Trump by 13 points in 2024, and despite polling showing it a close race, Rick Scott won his Senate race by 12.8%. But even still, that was under 15 points, and in an election environment that's going to be a lot more Democratic friendly than 2024 was, I think we can say Florida will be likely Republican and not safe Republican in 2026. Okay, so now the next state that I would consider to be likely Republican would be the state of Kansas. Now, Kansas is going to be an interesting Senate race as well. This is Republican incumbent Roger Marshall, and this one is a little bit going under the radar for potentially being competitive. Marshall is not really facing too much of a serious primary. He'll be the Republican candidate once again. The Democrats do have a lot of candidates running. The most notable candidate, I would say, in this race is Adam Hamilton, the pastor, who initially considered running for this race as an independent. And one specific poll gives this race a little bit of pause. This race is listed as either solid Republican or likely Republican, or really across the board here. From the Tavern Research Democratic pollster for Roger Marshall versus Adam Hamilton, it was about an 8-point lead for Roger Marshall in that race. When it was hypothetical of Marshall versus Hamilton as an independent, it actually showed Adam Hamilton winning in this race. Now, there's a lot of stock to put in one poll, which I'll admit when making my rankings for this video, it did make me a little bit skeptical of actually putting Kansas in this category. But Kansas is a state that voted for Donald Trump by 16 points in 2024, which is about 1 point above the 15-point threshold. But then in 2020, it voted 14.6% for Donald Trump, which was actually under that 15-point threshold. And in that same Senate race in 2020, when Roger Marshall was elected, he won by 11.4% of the vote here. Now, a third-party candidate in Buckley took about 5% of the vote away. That could potentially play a role in maybe why it was under 15 points. But nevertheless, it was under 15 points in 2020. And in an election environment that I think will be relatively similar, if not more Democratic, I think Kansas, at least for now, will fall under that 15-point Republican margin. Again, we'll have to wait and see over the next few months how this race develops. If it's truly competitive, if it goes back to solid Republican, we'll have to wait and see. But I think falling under 15 points is a good place to put it right now for Kansas. The last state on this map that I would consider to be likely Republican right now is the state of Montana. Now, Montana is an interesting case because this is the Republican Senator Steve Daines. He dropped out literally last second before the filing deadline, and he appointed his, I would say, chosen successor in Cart Almy, a former U.S. attorney for the District of Montana. Now, the Republicans have quickly consolidated behind Almy. President Trump, Steve Daines, Tim Sheehy, and Greg Gianforte are all with him. On the Democratic side, there are a lot of candidates running, and this primary is, should be over by the time you're seeing this video, but my assumption, again, the primary for when I'm recording this video has not yet happened, but my assumption is Riley Neal, this former state representative, will be the Democratic candidate. What makes this race interesting, though, is the presence of independent candidate Seth Bodnar. He is someone that in the general election polling has the race either as likely Republican or lean Republican. One major poll from Tavern Research shows that when it's Curt Almy versus Riley Neal versus Seth Bodnar, Curt Almy wins by a safe Republican margin of 20 points. There's just too much vote split between Riley Neal at 24% and Bodnar at 26% in this poll. But when it's a head-to-head 1v1 matchup of Almy versus Riley Neal, it's 58-42. It's still a safe Republican win. When it goes to Curt Almy versus Seth Bodnar, it's a 50-50 race. So what does this mean? Because it is a Democratic-affiliated pollster. So does this mean that Montana Senate race, is a toss-up? Right now, I would say no, given how red of a state it usually is. It voted for Steve Daines in 2020 by 10 points against the current governor of the time, Steve Bullock, who is a very popular governor in the state of Montana. And then in 2024, the Democratic incumbent Senator John Tester lost re-election to the Republican Tim Sheehy by 7.1%, though that is pretty competitive, especially for a state like Montana. On the presidential level, it voted for Trump by nearly 20 points in 2024, voted for Trump by 16.4% in 2020. So the reason I'm putting this race as likely Republican is I'm anticipating at some point we're going to see maybe the Democratic candidate drop out of the race and endorse Seth Bodnar. It's possible Montana falls under 15 points anyway, even with the Democrat and the independent running, if some of that support from Bodnar slips away or vice versa. But I think we're going to see Montana, without an incumbent in the race, in an election environment that's more Democratic friendly, fall a hair under 15 points. If it becomes a 1v1 race of Bodnar versus Almy, that could potentially get interesting, and then the developing polling from there may give us an indicator of how this race could be going. But Montana starts out likely Republican. Okay, so those are all the likely Republican races I have right now. This is where, in my opinion, the Senate map really starts. Republicans have 46 Senate seats, Democrats have 44, and there are 10 remaining Senate seats currently in the toss-up category. Now, for my rankings, toss-up is anything that's considered 5 points or under. So essentially, you could say this is my battleground map on the 2026 Senate elections. Now, I could leave all Senate seats as toss-up and just end the video here, but that would be very boring and no fun, and also not really putting any stakes on the Senate elections if I were to do that. So I'm going to assign my actual rankings to these competitive Senate races. We're going to start first with the state of Nebraska. Nebraska is going to be a Senate race where this is Republican incumbent U.S. Senator Pete Ricketts, and he'll be facing off against Democrat Cindy Burbank and independent candidate Dan Osborne. Now, what's interesting in this race is the prospects of Cindy Burbank potentially dropping out of this race and endorsing Dan Osborne. The Democratic primary between Cindy Burbank and William Forbes was an interesting primary due to the fact that Dan Osborne went after William Forbes because Forbes was a candidate that he believed to be propped up by the Republicans that would stay in the race and split votes from Dan Osborne. Whereas Cindy Burbank is a Democratic candidate that is more of an ally of Dan Osborne and has the potential to drop out of the race and coalesce support around Dan Osborne. Now, the rankings on this race have it as either likely Republican or lean Republican as of today. And the polling for Pete Ricketts versus Cindy Burbank shows roughly about a 9-point lead for Ricketts in that race. Now, for Ricketts versus Osborne, they've all been Democratic polls, but they've shown a much more competitive race. The most recent poll from the beginning of May from Tavern Research shows Osborne at 47%, Ricketts at 42%, with 12% undecided. That is a 5-point lead for Osborne over Ricketts. Now, do I ultimately think Dan Osborne is going to win this race by 5? No, I don't. We've seen this in similar circumstances in Nebraska, and I think maybe in Kansas with Greg Orman as well, as Republican candidates versus independent candidates. Typically, the Republican incumbents do end up winning, but the polling shows a very tight race. And this one may be no different here. We can look at the Senate election in 2024 as an example. Deb Fischer defeated Dan Osborne by 6.7% against Dan Osborne. I already said Osborne twice. But point being, she won it by 6.7%, which is a likely Republican ranking. On the same ballot, Pete Ricketts defeated a Democratic candidate by 25.2% on that election. Now, Nebraska overall as a state is interesting. It voted across the entire state for Donald Trump by 20.5% in 2024. It voted for Trump in 2020 by 19%. So it's usually a safe Republican race. But for an independent candidate like Dan Osborne that is running, he makes this race more competitive. So there's a few things going on here. The Osborne factor makes this race a competitive race. I do believe Pete Ricketts is a stronger incumbent and will take Osborne's candidacy a lot more serious than Deb Fischer would, but at the same time, you're in an election environment that would be considered more Democratic friendly than 2024, in 2026. So what does that mean? I think despite those factors of Ricketts taking Osborne seriously, I think we still see Nebraska fall under 5 points in a closer election than may be expected, but one that I do think the Republicans are favored to hold on and win due to how usually Republican the state of Nebraska is. Osborne makes this race competitive, but it's one that I do think the Republicans ultimately hold. Next door to Nebraska, we have the state of Iowa. Iowa is a little bit of a similar story, though I would say it has the potential to even be more competitive here due to the fact that Republican Senator Joni Ernst is not running for re-election. U.S. Representative Ashley Hinson, who has the endorsement of President Trump, will end up being the Republican candidate. On the Democratic side, Josh Turek and Zach Walz still have their primary to play out as the time I'm recording this video. But again, I'm very confident Josh Turek is going to win this race as the leading candidate in most of the polling. As for the general, a little bit of a split view here. Likely Republican from some rankings, tilt Republican from race to the White House, and toss up from Real Clear Politics and The Economist. The most recent polls, there's only 3 in this race. The most recent poll from Echelon Insights, a Republican pollster, shows Turek leading Hinson 46-45, whereas the 2 prior polls from Democratic pollsters show Hinson up by 4 points and by 3 points. Now, we know in the state of Iowa, polling has always been a little bit wonky, and we very rarely get a complete, accurate picture of the state. However, Iowa's voted for Donald Trump very solidly. In 2024, it went for Trump by 13 points. In 2020, it voted for Trump by 8 points. On the Senate side, it's been a bit more competitive. In 2020, it voted for Joni Ernst by only 6.5%. But the governor's race in 2018 is the main optimism for Democrats, where the Republican Kim Reynolds only won by 2.7%. Now, the Democrats are hoping in the state of Iowa that Rob Sand, the Democratic nominee for governor in the state of Iowa, is running very strongly in the race right now, so much so that he may even potentially end up winning that race. And they're hoping with him at the top of the ticket, he may drag the Democrat like Josh Turek maybe up in the numbers as well and give the Democrats a chance at flipping the Senate race in Iowa. Now, it's still going to be a very tough battle as Iowa has moved very much the Republican direction in the President Trump era of the Republican Party. Democrats are hoping with the economy right now, the price of living across the United States, and with especially hurting Iowa farmers, it may be enough to flip this Senate race. But I do think Iowa's Republican DNA is a little bit too strong, but I do think the race does fall under 5 points given those shifts of the state of the United States right now. So Iowa I have going as lean Republican for Ashley Hinson, but it's one that I think we're going to see be the most competitive Senate race in Iowa, at least since that Joni Ernst 2020 Senate race. This puts the Republicans at 48, Democrats are at 44. Next, I'm going to go to the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire's Senate race is a very interesting race because it's one that started out looking like it could be competitive, but depending on the candidate, it probably wouldn't be, because the current governor of the state of New Hampshire is Kelly Ayotte. The former governor was Chris Sununu, and he is someone that considered running for Senate, both I believe it was in 2022 and 2026, and ultimately declined to do so. And from there, Democrats are very confident they're going to win this race. The Democratic incumbent Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is a definitely political powerhouse in the state of New Hampshire, declined to seek a 4th term, making it an open race. But the Democratic U.S. Representative Chris Pappas, he himself is a very strong electoral overperformer in the 1st Congressional District in New Hampshire, is a very strong candidate for the Democrats. However, the Republicans do end up actually having a strong candidate of their own in former U.S. Senator John E. Sununu, who is the brother of former Governor Chris Sununu. Also in the race is former U.S. Senator Scott Brown. He was a Massachusetts senator. He ran for Senate in New Hampshire against Shaheen in 2014 and ultimately only lost that race by under 3 points. So 2 former U.S. senators are running in New Hampshire, though the polling clearly shows John Sununu with a large lead in this race. And what this has done is this has turned what would be probably a pretty solid, likely Democratic race, and if Sununu and Brown were not running, maybe even a safe Democratic race depending on the polling, into one that looks more like a lean Democratic race. For Pappas versus Scott Brown, the polling still shows that Pappas would win by a very large amount. Pappas is currently leading Brown by roughly 10.8% in this race. Still 12.3% undecided, but Pappas has a very large lead to start out in this race. For Pappas versus Sununu, much more competitive ballgame here. Pappas is leading 46.7% for the Democrats. Sununu's at 42.3%, with 11% undecided. Now, given the most recent polling, which shows Pappas up by 7, and the most recent poll from UNH and the Emerson poll, Pappas is only up by 1. Now, the key in this race, and a big key in electoral politics in the state of New Hampshire, are the undecided voters, because New Hampshire is a state that I would say skews Democratic on the presidential and Senate and House levels, but skews Republican on the governor level. But there's a lot of independent voters in the state of New Hampshire, both from the state and from voters that moved from, say, Massachusetts or Vermont or Maine into New Hampshire. There are a lot of independent voters, and how they vote ultimately usually swings these races. And there's a good amount of undecided voters in this race. Sununu starting out at 42.3% and Pappas down at 46.7% gives the Republicans a opportunity at making the Senate race competitive and one of their only pickup opportunities on the Senate map. Now, that being said, the Republicans still have some ground to make up in this state, even with Sununu at the top of the ticket for the Republicans, as Kamala Harris did still win the state against Donald Trump in 2024. Despite Trump doing very well across the country, Harris won this race by 2.8%. 2020, Joe Biden won the state by 7.4%. But similar as we saw Democrats hoping in Iowa for Rob Sand to drag the Senate candidate to a victory, there could be a situation where Republicans are hoping Kelly Ayotte with John Sununu maybe can find a way to narrowly win the Senate race as well. So where do things ultimately shake out? I think if this Senate race were taking place in 2024, there's a very real chance that I would be putting this race as a lean Republican right now. But given the strong candidacies of both Pappas and Sununu, in this election environment where the president is not very popular right now, the Democrats are doing very well on the generic ballot, I'm still putting New Hampshire as lean Democrat, given the state and its DNA as being a more Democratic trending independent state. This is just not really the right election environment for Sununu to try to win back his Senate seat against a Democrat. Again, if this was 2024, maybe even potentially, I would say actually no, maybe just 2024. 2022 probably wouldn't flip either. But if this was 2024, it very well could be that the Senate race maybe would be a lean Republican flip. But for now, I think New Hampshire would go as lean for the Democrats. Democrats at 45, Republicans at 48. Next, we're going to go to the neighboring state of Maine, where in Maine, this is a very fascinating Senate race. This is the Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins. You'll likely heard her name. And she is the current Republican and only Republican U.S. Senator, not only in the state of Maine, but in all of New England, and in the only state that was won by Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. She won the state of Maine by roughly about 7 points. Susan Collins won her last Senate race in 2020 against the Democratic candidate Sarah Gideon by 8.6%. And this was very much a shock to many, as the polling heading into the race showed Gideon leading Collins by a very healthy amount. So as for this race, where things currently stand, if you're following elections, you're watching this video, you're probably a hardcore elections follower like myself. You'll know the noise going on in this race about the Democratic candidate in Graham Plattner, who Graham Plattner certainly has his large share of controversies and things that you would think maybe of a typical candidate would probably hurt his chances at winning here. And yet, in the polling data, Plattner's not really having any problems right now. This race, depending on the rankings, is either a toss-up in the Democratic favors from two of them or tilt Republican for one of them. But the polling data for Plattner versus Susan Collins is actually in a pretty similar spot to where the Collins versus Sarah Gideon numbers were. Graham Plattner currently has 48.75%. Susan Collins has 41.5% with 9.7% undecided. You would think typically that with a candidate like Graham Plattner who has these scandals breaking, this would probably be an automatic win for Susan Collins, right? Well, this is where I tell you, candidate quality and such isn't always everything. This is a state that voted for Kamala Harris and an election environment where President Trump is very unpopular and a time where the Republicans are very unpopular as well. So Susan Collins is the Republican incumbent. Yes, she does break with the president a good amount of the time for a Republican U.S. Senator, but Graham Plattner is the main Democratic candidate right now. He is also someone that would be considered more of like a populist type of Democratic candidate who, even with the scandals that he's facing, is doing a very strong job at coalescing a lot of these Democratic voters that did vote for Sarah Gideon, but also is expanding those votes into maybe getting independent voters and maybe even some former Republican voters that are disillusioned with the current party or maybe feel left behind. These are voters that Graham Plattner is coalescing in his group. So as for how this race goes, it's going to be really interesting because Plattner's scandal seems every single day there's a new scandal against him, and yet in the polls right now, he's leading by over 7 points. I'm not counting Susan Collins out of this race due to the fact that we saw this in 2020. She was able to surprise expectations and end up winning in a really shocking way, but we're going to have to wait and see how this goes. Maine does utilize a ranked choice voting system, so it'll be interesting to see also on election night, does Plattner or Collins win outright? Does it go to ranked choice voting? And how does that ultimately all shake out? It's going to be a fascinating race to watch over the next few months how this develops. But currently, given the election environment, yes, I understand the scandals Plattner has, but given the election environment and the current state of how the polling looks, I do think at very least Graham Plattner is going to win the Maine Senate race, and I would have it as lean Democrat, which again is in between 4.9% and 0%, probably closer to that like 4 to 3.5 point margin right now in the state of Maine. This puts Democrats at 46, Republicans currently at 48. Next, we're going to go to the state of Ohio. Ohio, this is a Senate race where this is Republican appointed incumbent Jon Husted. Now, this is also to fill the remainder of the term of J.D. Vance, similar with Marco Rubio, whose Senate race is up in 2028. Same thing with J.D. Vance's Senate seat, which is now held by Jon Husted. Now, Jon Husted is facing a challenge from the former U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, who, if that name sounds familiar, he just lost his longtime Senate seat in 2024 by only 3.6% against the Republican Bernie Moreno. So the Democrats, after Sherrod Brown lost the Senate race in 2024, got the best Democrat candidate in the state to run for the other Senate race 2 years later. And that's a very big thing, as Ohio voted for Donald Trump by 11 points in 2024 after voting for Trump by 8 points in 2020. But throughout Sherrod Brown's history, he's been someone that has overperformed in these races. He lost it by 3.6, despite Trump winning it by 8. You can go back to 2018 as well here, and you would see he won this race against the Republican by 6.8%. You can go back to his 2012 race even as well here, where he won his Senate race against the Republican Josh Mandel by 6 points. When at the top of the ticket in 2012, Obama won the state by 3. So Sherrod Brown is a very strong political candidate in the state of Ohio and is going to be one that's going to put in a very formidable fight against the Republicans. And the current polling data right now, most of the rankings have it as a toss-up. 1 does, or 2 do have it in the advantage of Jon Husted, the Republican. The current polling data shows Jon Husted leading, but it's by a very close amount. Husted is 49%, Brown has 46%, with 3% overall lead for Husted, but still 5% undecided. So yes, Jon Husted has a lead, but there is enough undecided vote out there for Sherrod Brown to essentially come back and win the Senate race. Do I ultimately think it happens? I do think Ohio has just moved a little bit too far to the right over the last 20 years or so for Sherrod Brown to ultimately win. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, as the governor's race of Vivek Ramaswamy and Amy Acton is looking very competitive as well. So it's possible Ohio could have a big Democratic resurgence in this midterm election environment, elect a Democratic senator and Democratic governor. But for right now, I do think it falls under 3 points. But I do think the Republican Jon Husted holds on and wins this Senate race, though I think it's going to make Republicans really sweat in how close this Senate race does ultimately end up being. This puts the Republicans at 49, Democrats at 46. Next, we're going to go to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina, if you follow in the state, you'll know how close it is at the presidential level. It voted for Donald Trump by 3 points in 2024, only voting for Trump by 1.3% in 2020. It voted the Senate race in 2022 for Ted Budd by 3.2%. Then Republican incumbent Thom Tillis in 2020 only wins it by 1.7% in that race. So North Carolina is a perennially close state, and it's looking like it's going to be once again. But there's a very special case in the Senate race. Thom Tillis is not running. Michael Whatley, the former chair of the Republican National Committee, is. But Democratic candidate is Roy Cooper, the former governor of North Carolina, who won 2 elections in 2020 and in 2016. 2020, Cooper wins re-election by 4.5% against the Republican Dan Forest. 2016, he wins against the Republican Governor Pat McCrory by 0.22%. Now, that is very significant. We've seen past circumstances of governors running for Senate against either senators or open races, and in some cases they win, in some cases they lose. One example could be the Senate race I mentioned in 2020. Steve Bullock runs against Steve Daines, and he loses by 10 points. but Montana is a safe Republican state at the presidential level. It's not a toss-up state. A better example for the North Carolina race would be Florida, where then Republican Governor Rick Scott ran against Democratic Senator Bill Nelson, and Rick Scott shots everybody, winning it by 1/12 of a percentage point. As for North Carolina, though, Roy Cooper is hoping to do that, but he is polling much better in this current position. Most of their rankings now have it listed as either lean Democrat. Some even have it as likely Democrat. And the early polling data is why. Roy Cooper is currently at 49.2%. Michael Whatley's at 40.8%, with 10% currently undecided in this race. And this race right now is really interesting because Michael Whatley, on paper, is not really a bad Republican candidate. He just doesn't have a lot of name recognition. He's never run for the office in for elected office in North Carolina before. He's been the RNC, but that's not political office. That is like a private position. So he has no electoral history, and him only polling at 40.8% is a very real concern for the Republicans. Roy Cooper, being the former governor of the state of North Carolina, someone that North Carolina voters know very well, and based on his current polling numbers of 49.2%, seem to like very well. I bet when things ultimately shake down, we see things certainly narrow up in this race, but I think Roy Cooper has such an early lead, already above 49% in the polls here. It puts him in a really strong position. He only has to win 0.9% of those 10 points that are undecided. Michael Whatley has to literally win pretty much every single vote to beat Roy Cooper in this race. Ultimately, how it currently shakes out in the North Carolina Senate race, though in the past I've been bullish on North Carolina being more of a lean Republican state than a lean Democratic state, I have to put North Carolina as lean Democrat, as Roy Cooper has put himself in a very strong position in the Senate race. But ultimately, how I think this race shakes out, I think that governor's race that he won in 2020, where he defeated the Republican Dan Forest by 4.5%, 51.5 to 47, I think is right around that margin we're going to see Roy Cooper ultimately win by. Because a lot of that undecided vote, I think, will coalesce around the Republican Michael Whatley, but I do think Roy Cooper is going to break 50%, winning this race, and also being the first Democrat to win since the late Senator Kay Hagan won her Senate race, and I believe it was 2008. So that would be very big for the Democrats in North Carolina. But North Carolina, I have Roy Cooper winning. This is currently the second flip, on the Senate map after the state of Maine. So two of the most vulnerable senators up in this election are Susan Collins and Tom Tillis' Senate seats, and both of them I have flipping to the Democrats in these updated rankings. This puts the Democrats at 47. The next one I'm going to go is the state of Georgia. Georgia, this is Democratic incumbent U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff. And as of the time of recording this video, we still don't know who the Republican candidate is going to be for sure. We do know that Representative Mike Collins and Derek Dooley, the former Tennessee football coach, are going to a runoff election. We're going to have to wait and see how that sorts itself out. The most recent polling has shown Mike Collins leading in all of the polls, though depending on which poll you look at, the margins differ. The most recent poll from JMC Analytics shows Collins leading over Dooley by more than 10 points, but for insider advantage, this shows it only a 5-point race. President Trump has not made an endorsement in this race as of the time I'm recording this video, but if he decides to endorse Collins or Dooley, this could sway a very considerable amount in this race, as we saw with the Texas Senate race with Paxton versus Cornyn. President Trump's endorsement makes a very big difference in the primaries. In terms of the general election, a little bit of a split ranking here, whether it's toss-up, likely Democrat, or lean Democrat, but most would agree this race is currently in the favor of Jon Ossoff, who has raised already over $81 million with $32 million cash on hand. Now, Ossoff is someone that Democrats, certainly in the state of Georgia, want to win, and they want him to keep going. Ossoff is also seen a little bit as a sneaky potential 2028 either presidential or vice presidential contender as well. So he's certainly someone Democrats would like to see win this race. As for the polling matchups, Ossoff currently leads over Mike Collins, 47.3 to 43, a 4.3% lead. For Ossoff versus Dooley, Ossoff is at 46.7, Dooley's at 39.9. Ossoff leads here about 6.75%. So what's interesting here is Collins does better than Derek Dooley at consolidating Republican support, but Ossoff also does about 0.7% better consolidating support as well against Mike Collins, whereas Derek Dooley, he's at 46.7%. So it'll be interesting to see here. You could argue in favor of Collins or Dooley being the stronger Republican candidate either way here, but Ossoff starts out with a lead in this race. I think he currently leads in this race, but I wouldn't even say as the Democratic incumbent it's as insurmountable as even potentially the North Carolina Senate races, where in the polling data, Roy Cooper's already near 50% at 49. Ossoff is still around 47.3. So there's a little bit of a gap here in this race for the Republicans, if they get this primary right, to have a chance at flipping this race. Sort of an example that kind of came to mind when looking at these polling data was the Jackie Rosen race in 2024 in the state of Nevada, where Rosen ends up winning by 1.6% over the Republican Sam Brown, where she was polling roughly around that 47% number, but the Republican Sam Brown was down around 43% in most polls in the final few days. The Republican just didn't coalesce enough support, ended up getting about 46%. Now, in Georgia, it won't work the exact same way because Georgia's election law stipulates the winning candidate must break 50% of the vote, and if they don't on election night, they have to go to a runoff election between the top two vote getters. So whether it's Mike Collins or Derek Dooley, if no one breaks 50% of the vote, they'll go to a runoff of one of them versus Jon Ossoff. And the way Democrats have done in the runoff elections in the past few election years has looked very, very strong for the Democrats. In 2022, Raphael Warnock in his runoff defeated Herschel Walker by 2.8%. And in 2021, this was the runoff election from the 2020 Senate race, Ossoff won against David Perdue by 1.2%, and Raphael Warnock won by 2.1% in that initial special election. This is with the state of Georgia as well, being one of the most competitive battleground states in the presidential race as well, voting for Donald Trump by 2.2% in 2024, voting for Biden by 0.24% in 2020. And obviously to talk about Georgia, it's a very red state outside of the Atlanta area and the surrounding counties, but Atlanta and the surrounding counties are growing rapidly in population and are becoming more and more Democratic by every single election. So where this race currently stands, it has the potential to be very competitive if the Republicans get this right. I have my own thoughts and own opinions on Collins versus Dooley for who I think would be the more competitive candidate. I think, honestly, even though he has a lower amount of support, I think Derek Dooley gives the Republicans a better chance. And I do believe Mike Collins did have a scandal break regarding a statement or a memo his campaign account put out that may hurt him in a general election that I think Derek Dooley wouldn't have. But ultimately, I do think either way, Jon Ossoff is currently favored in this race, has a lead in this race, and whether it's a runoff election or in general, we're going to have to wait and see. I think it's possible Ossoff wins without needing a runoff election, but either way, I think it falls under 5 points. But I do certainly think Jon Ossoff is the favorite to win the Senate race in the state of Georgia right now. So this puts the Democrats at 48, Republicans are at 49. We have 3 Senate races remaining, and 3 that are very much volatile and kind of unpredictable, each for different reasons. But we're going to start with the state of Texas, where Texas, we just got some big news in the last 2 weeks or so, as the time you're seeing this video, and that the matchup is officially set. Ken Paxton, the Republican Attorney General, has officially successfully primary challenged out U.S. Senator John Cornyn in the Republican primary. President Trump, in the final few days of the runoff campaign, endorsed Ken Paxton, and now John Cornyn, the incumbent, will not be reelected to another 6-year term. Now, James Talarico is the Democratic candidate. He won the Democratic primary against Jasmine Crockett, and this is going to be a very fascinating race. It's likely Republican from Inside Elections, lean Republican from Sabato and Cook Political Report as of May 26th after the Paxton news came out, and then toss up from the other rankings. Now, the current polling data shows James Talarico leading by 2.7%, with 14.1% currently undecided. So there is a ton of undecided vote in this race. And the battle lines on this one are going to be absolutely fascinating, because this is almost a repeat of the 2018 Senate race between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, where you had a Republican candidate that many in the consensus among Republicans, Independents, and Democrats would consider to be an unpopular candidate, versus a Democratic candidate who is someone that both in the state of Texas and among the national media is beloved, especially by the national media, hyping up Talarico as a rising star candidate, someone that is definitely doing very strong with Democrats, but also doing strong with independents, and even some of those disillusioned Republicans, like those who maybe supported John Cornyn and don't like the scandals that Ken Paxton has, and may want to throw their support behind Cornyn. I think Texas has the possibility of being one of the most volatile races in the country, which is fascinating given that Texas voted for Donald Trump by 13.7% in 2024. But if you want James Tallarico to win, don't let that number scare you. As in 2020, Trump only won the state by 5.6%, which is less than he won by Iowa and Ohio. So Texas has a real opportunity here at potentially electing a Democratic senator for the first time in a very long time. And Ken Paxton being the Republican candidate is a large reason why. Now, does this mean ultimately that James Tallarico will win this race? For sure, no. Because Texas is still given more of a Republican race. It did elect Ted Cruz, even though that Senate race in 2018, if that election environment is shaping up to be similar to 2026, you could say, well, does that mean the Republicans should still win by about 2 or 3 points in the state? You could make that argument. You could also make the argument Ken Paxton, given his scandals, may arguably be a weaker Republican candidate than Ted Cruz, and maybe even James Tallarico could do better in appealing to a lot of those voters than Beto O'Rourke did in that race due to the fact that Ken Paxton is more scandal-plagued. So in terms of this race, this may honestly be as close to a true toss-up on the map as there really is. But given President Trump has already announced that he intends to go out and campaign for Ken Paxton several times in the state, I think the president, even though he's down roughly 20 points, he knows a state like Texas where the midterm elections are very turnout dependent. Ken Paxton is someone that will get the Republican base out, but he needs to get as many voters as possible to thwart off Tallarico, who is going to get Democratic voters in droves and a lot of independent voters to turn out for him. So what happens ultimately? Texas, I think, is a very close race. I think it easily falls under 3 points between Paxton and Tallarico. I do think currently right now, Ken Paxton has a very slight advantage in this race, but this is certainly one I'm watching very, very closely over the next few months because this one really may come down to the wire where Texas may potentially flip and elect a Democratic senator for the first time in a very long time. So this puts the Republicans at 50, Democrats at 48. Next, we're going to go to the state of Alaska. Alaska is a race that would not typically be very competitive, but in this race it is, and it's because the Democrats have essentially an A-plus candidate running. The Republican incumbent U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan is running. He is also facing another Republican candidate in Dan J. Sullivan, who is not related to the incumbent, but due to the paperwork of Alaska elections where it does not list on the ballot, I believe, who the incumbent is, that could potentially take votes away from Dan Sullivan, which is a very interesting situation here that may have an impact on the general. As for the Democrat, the leading candidate is Mary Peltola, the former U.S. representative from Alaska's at-large congressional district. Now, as for the general election, and the way it works in Alaska, I do believe, is they hold a primary election, which I believe is going to take place on August 18th, and the top 4 vote candidates will advance to a general election that does utilize ranked choice voting. So if no candidate breaks 50% outright on the first ballot, it goes to ranked choice voting, goes to the final 2, and that'll decide the race here. This race is currently listed as either lean Republican or toss-up. Most of the rankings do have it lean Republican, though. The early polling from the race to the White House polling average, Mary Peltola is currently leading at 48.1, Dan Sullivan's at 44.5, with 7.4% undecided. Now, when you look at the polling data that's come out, it's pretty much all been from either Alaska Survey Research or public policy polling. The most recent poll came out in the middle of May, with Peltola at 48, Sullivan at 44, 8% saying other. When you look at how Mary Peltola has performed in the past, she's a very strong candidate. She lost re-election in 2024 against the Republican Nick Begich only by 2 points, in an election that Donald Trump won the state of Alaska by 13 points. She also won the special election, I believe it was in 2022, as well, and then went on to the general election and defeated Sarah Palin by 9.9%. So she is someone that is a unique Democratic candidate that does very well in the state of Alaska. And the fact that based on the polling data, she's already at 48 or 49% kind of puts her in the same territory that Roy Cooper is currently polling in. She's only 1 point down of where Roy Cooper is currently polling, and she's technically above what John Ossoff is polling in these early numbers right now as well. Again, it's possible, given the state of Alaska voted for Donald Trump by 13 points, the polls end up being wildly off, and in hindsight, this may look kind of ridiculous. But based on where things currently stand right now, given the midterm election environment that's expected, given the current polling data of President Trump and the Republicans, and given the strength of candidacy that Mary Peltola has, I am currently projecting this race goes to ranked choice voting, and Mary Peltola wins this race by under 2 points. About as close as we could really get. But I do think Mary Peltola is a unique Democratic candidate, and kind of being bold here, I would actually put this race as lean Democratic right now. That's where things currently stand in the state of Alaska, a state that is not too accustomed to electing Democrats for U.S. Senate. The last time there was a Democratic U.S. Senator may have been a member, I believe, of the Begich family. You'd have to go back to 2008, I think it was. Yes, it was 2008, where Begich, I believe this was Mark Begich, defeated the Republican Ted Stevens. You have to go back to 2008 for that to be the case. But right now, I would put Alaska as lean Democrat, with the Republican Dan Sullivan. He has another Dan Sullivan to work on and work with that as well. But I think Alaska is currently lean Democrat in this race. Next, we have the state of Michigan, where Michigan is very much a wild card right now. Because Michigan, in terms of how it usually votes, is very competitive. It voted for Donald Trump by 1.4% in 2024, which I believe, when you account for Alaska, Georgia, and North Carolina, of all the battleground states that Trump won, it's the most close to flipping state on the presidential map from 2024. It voted for Joe Biden by 2.8% in 2020. The Senate race was very close as well. Elisa Slotkin won by only 0.34% against the Republican candidate Mike Rogers, though that was in 2024 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, helping to drive votes out for Mike Rogers from Donald Trump as well, though. For this Senate race in the state of Michigan, it's going to come down, I think, to which candidates end up being, because we know Mike Rogers will be the Republican candidate. Democratic candidates Abdul El-Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens are running in a very competitive primary, and also a very nasty primary too. Now, Abdul El-Sayed currently is the leader in this primary, but there's still over 36% of vote undecided in this race. And some Democrats are concerned, as this race is listed as a toss-up by most, that Abdul El-Sayed versus Mike Rogers gives the Republicans the best chance to win. And that's what the polling data currently says. Rogers is leading by 3.5% against Abdul El-Sayed at 44.1%. Sayed is 40.6%. Now, for McMorrow versus Rogers, Rogers is still leading, but he's at 43.4%. McMorrow's at 41.4%. It is a 2-point lead for Mike Rogers. And then for Haley Stevens versus Mike Rogers, Rogers is currently leading by 1.6% over Haley Stevens. Now, the elephant in the room here for sure is going to be the undecided vote, as there's still roughly 15% of respondents that are undecided in this race. Obviously, Republicans will get more than 44, Democrats will get more than 40.5, but what do those undecided voters do? There's some concern that Abdul El-Sayed may be too far left for the general election in Michigan, and maybe someone like McMorrow or Haley Stevens would have a better chance of winning the general election. Does it ultimately all shake out? I can't really 100% say in certainty. I do think the polling is correct that Abdul El-Sayed gives the Republicans the best chance of winning this race, but there's still such a large amount of undecided voters left out there. The Democrats still certainly can win this race. Though, as Abdul El-Sayed is the leading Democratic candidate, I think we could potentially see Michigan go by probably under 1 point, maybe 1.5% or lower, in the direction of the Republicans. And with Abdul El-Sayed right now, this is a flip from my prior ranking. I would put Michigan as lean Republican. But I don't think it's 100% a foregone conclusion in this election environment where Trump is down by roughly about 20 points. The Republicans are losing the generic ballot by about 8 points. I don't think it's 100% certainty that the Democrats, even if they nominate Abdul El-Sayed, are going to lose the Senate race in Michigan. But I do think right now, Mike Rogers is leading by Abdul El-Sayed by about 4 points. I think that's enough to narrowly flip the state of Michigan into the Republican category. So where we end up is a very interesting Senate map where Republicans have 51, Democrats have 49. The Republicans hold the Senate majority despite losing the Senate seats in Maine, North Carolina, and Alaska, but Republicans do flip one Democratic seat in the state of Michigan with a lot of very close calls on this map. For now, though, that is it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Stay tuned, as I do have a governor elections predictions and House elections prediction coming out in the next few days that I think you're really going to enjoy. Those come out at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So for now, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video.